Hello everyone, and welcome back to the NGT Briefing, the series that breaks down the EU's debate on new genomic techniques, one issue at a time. We are unpacking one of the most technically challenging topics of discussion in the EU's NGT file, traceability and labeling. Why did the original proposal leave out traceability and labeling? Could new labeling rules make it harder to bring NGT innovations to the market in the EU? And what would new requirements mean for the plant breeders, food producers, and farmers? To help us navigate these questions, I'm joined by Garlich von Essen, Secretary General of Euroseeds, and Laetitia Trepos, Environmental and Agronomic Affairs Manager at CEFS. So let's dive in.
My name is Garlich von Essen. I am the Secretary General and CEO of Euroseeds, and Euroseeds is the European level organization bringing together all national seed associations and direct individual company members involved in plant breeding, in seed production and variety development.
My name is Laetitia Trepos and I am the Environmental and Agricultural Affairs Manager at CEFS, so the European Sugar Manufacturers Association. CEFS represents the beet sugar manufacturers from across the European Union and Switzerland. Our members transform the sugar beets into white sugar that is used in a wide variety of food and non-food applications.
Could you please explain what the EU is currently discussing when it comes to traceability and labeling of seeds developed using NGTs, and why this is such a hot topic?
The discussion is a bit broader than seeds. It is, I think, the result of old legislation that we have in the European Union since the early 2000s, and which refers to the traceability and labeling of GMO products or products obtained through GMOs. And we have a similar debate now. So should we use the same approach, an endpoint traceability and labeling approach, also for plants and then further products, resulting from these so-called new genomic techniques.
Speaking of Category 1 NGTs, Euroseeds was one of the 27 organizations from the agri-food sector that signed a recent joint statement opposing mandatory labeling and traceability for this category. Can you explain why such requirements would actually be problematic for plant breeders and the wider agri-food chain in Europe?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it probably is more of a problem for the wider agri-food chain than it is for the original plant breeding company that would place a respective product on the market. Imagine you are a farmer, you're using two different plant varieties, one NGT, one conventional, in two fields that are next to each other. Are you going to separate that harvest? Are you going to store it separately on your farm? Are you going to market it separately to the next stage? Will that next stage then also store it separately and then market it again separately to the next level, processing, for example? The further you go down the line, up to the final food company and retail company, the more complicated, costly, and potentially impossible it will get.
Mandatory traceability and labeling on the final product will actually create a huge barrier to the development of new breeding techniques in our industry, because it would require segregation of the commodities inside the factory, because the sugar beets deteriorate super quickly once they're removed from the soils. That means that we have a process that is continuous and that cannot be paused to switch from a sugar beet type to another sugar beet type. So only one variety can be processed at a time. And the sugar beet factories are not designed to segregate between different beet flows. And even if we ignore all these issues and we suppose that we manage to actually do this, that there will be a problem at the storage level, because once the sugar is processed, it is stored usually in silos, and all the produced sugar is stored at the same place.
As you said yourself, right now, the agri-food chain is extremely complex. Maybe to help viewers understand the practical implications, could you walk us through a typical journey that goes from a seed to the plate, and where along this path actually the traceability and labeling requirements might kind of introduce a bottleneck and challenges?
We have a lot of earlier stages. We look at the first stage, which would be our stage, so the plant breeding sector, seed production sector. Before a commercial seed in the end reaches a farmer, you already have that seed that has moved between different locations and that may include actually different continents, a couple of times in early generations before the final one, the commercial seed, is marketed to a farmer. So that farmer will, on average, not use one single variety, but that farmer will use various varieties of the same species on his farm. So you will use different varieties on those specific soils that are best adapted to it. And not necessarily all of them will probably be NGT varieties, but they will end up in the same usage. And the further down you walk the chain, the more that will apply the product as far as the breeding process is concerned, rather than the quality of the product itself, makes it hellishly complicated. Everything would need to be doubled up or quadrupled as regards separation, identification, control, etc. So that is a very, very complicated, and with that also, of course, very costly process.
Maybe building on that, a recent study by Wageningen University suggests that mandatory labeling could actually reduce the economic viability of NGTs by up to 80%, which to me sounds quite alarming. Do you share this concern, and what might actually that mean for innovation and competitiveness within the EU plant breeding and agri-food sectors?
We definitely share the concern, and even more because for our sugar beet sector, the consequences of mandatory labeling could be even more drastic. We fear that if labeling on the final packaging becomes mandatory, it will completely 100% annihilate the hopes for breeding innovation in our sector. There will be no investment that is made for the development of sugar beet new genomic technique varieties, because no European factory would actually have the capacity to process and therefore to buy such sugar beets.
Now looking beyond the EU, supply chains in the agri-food sector are highly cross-border. And the joint statement also warned about the potential trade disruptions from traceability and labeling rules. Could you elaborate on this? What could this actually mean for the EU role in global seed and food systems?
It would actually be quite disruptive because third countries have less stringent rules, and abroad, new genomic techniques would not need to be labeled in such a strict way, and they would enter the European market anyway. There would be a global asymmetry. Third countries already allow new genomic techniques without labeling them, and we have no way of controlling what comes on the European market. There is no scientific way today to detect whether they are from NGTs or conventional plants. In the end, it would only make the European Union lose competitiveness and harm the European agriculture.
But then in your view, what could be the reasonable compromise, one that actually upholds transparency for farmers and consumers, but avoids introducing barriers that could stifle NGT innovation and uptake in Europe?
Honestly speaking, I think, well, you either do traceability in labeling or you do not. I think it is difficult for me to see how this fundamental request can be accommodated in a legislation that originally says we want to define what plants we consider to be identical or equivalent to those that we already know. So it's a little bit illogical to say it is the same, but we don't treat it the same. As far as the plant breeding sector is concerned, we are probably the ones that can work with a certain identification requirement.
We firmly believe that for category 1 genomic technique plants, which are conventional-like, transparency is sufficiently ensured through the setting up of a public database, and also for the labeling of seed bags and the inclusion of a mention in the catalog provided in the legislation on plant reproductive materials. These are solutions that have already been set by the European Commission in its original proposal and that are sufficient.
As we look ahead to the Danish presidency's role in facilitating this political agreement, do you have any key message or messages to EU policymakers seeking to find a balanced solution on traceability and labeling?
The European policy must remain coherent and aligned with science and progress. Any mandatory labeling on the final product will actually block the breeding innovation on several agri-food sectors, not only ours.
Let's keep our fingers crossed that in the end we will succeed and Europe will start catching up with the rest of the world on NGTs.
That is it for this episode of the NGT Briefing. A big thank you to Garlich and Laetitia for shedding light on the practical and political stakes of traceability and labeling in the EU's NGT proposal. proposal. In our final episode, we'll take on the 20 modifications threshold that defines which plants can qualify as Category 1 NGTs. Don't miss it, and see you then!